sign me up for the Christian Jubilee. Write my name on the roll. I've been changed since the Lord has lifted me. I want to be ready when Jesus comes.
Okay. Well, hello everybody and welcome back to the short course on biblical interpretation. And I'm just scrolling to get back down to my notes for the night. And Lisa, would you tell me if I freeze at all? Okay. This is where the Benny Hill music starts, right? Okay. All right. So welcome back to the short course in biblical interpretation. And tonight we're going to be talking about social scientific criticism, which sounds very scary, but it's not too scary. And our quote for tonight, besides starting off with our Pierre Bourdieu quote, and actually this is where, when I get to the end, I'm going to kind of come back to this idea of Bourdieu's, because when we start getting into these, what they call scientific approaches or things like that, this is where I think Bourdieu really comes in. When you start getting out of the decoding and into the kind of interpreting, and I would say social scientific is kind of a bridge between the two. Mm-hmm. When you start getting into that, you start getting into a place where it's actually more helpful to have multiple methods working together rather than trying to look only through one aspect. So that's why Bourdieu says, right, there's only a perspective seeing, only a perspective knowing. Mm-hmm. And the more affects we allow to speak about one thing, the more different eyes we can use to observe one thing, the more complete will our concept of this thing, our objectivity. So we're gonna see more and more as the next 5 weeks go on, how this is gonna really kind of dovetail, I hope, nicely towards the end. And our quote for the night that's not Bourdieu, it comes from Genesis 34:12 through 15. I had another one that I was thinking about because of what's happening in the Holy Land right now, it was a little bit too on the nose. So I decided against it. Oh, we have so another thing that's happening tonight is the Evanston Bulldogs are having a meeting about nutrition that Kroger is running in our basement, and so some of the kids are running around.
There's someone that just went after them.
Okay, good. But they're taking care of their kids, but that doesn't mean there might not be some extra noise.
Right.
So like I said, so I had another one. It was from 1 Samuel chapter 18. It also has to do with the marriage of David, but it was just a little bit too much. Like, I don't really want to be. It was a little bit too much for me to use that. So fortunately, when we're talking about marriage practices in the Bible, there are plenty of opportunities to find pieces of scripture that are used for marriage. So this is called the scene is called the rape of Dinah. That's Jacob, who became Israel. It's his only daughter. Mm-hmm. And the quote is this: "Put the marriage," and this is Shechem, who's the person who raped Dinah. "Put the marriage present and gift as high as you like, and I will give whatever you ask me. Only give me the young woman to be my wife." The sons of Jacob answered Shechem and his father Hamor deceitfully, because he had defiled their sister Dinah. They said to them, "We cannot do this thing to give our sister to one who is uncircumcised, for that would be a disgrace to us. Only on this condition will we consent to you, that you will become as we are, and every male among you be circumcised." That's a very strange bride gift, isn't it? That's not the only time that the bride gift has not been monetary in the Bible. All right, so I'm going to put us on these key terms, but I just want to do a kind of short introduction to social scientific criticism before we get to the key terms. And I promise I will try not to use any of the key terms before we get to them. But social scientific criticism refers to the use of sociology, anthropology, and archaeology in the study of the Bible. So its core tenet is that just like we need to understand the social, cultural, and religious background of current ritual practices, say in churches, synagogues, mosques, temples, and one of the books that I used, Steinberg, and you'll see it on the bibliography later. She said, you know, what if you asked somebody to describe why Jewish men and sometimes Jewish women wear head coverings when they go, either when they go into the synagogue, or some they wear it all the time. And she said she asked a class of young kids this one time, and they were like, maybe because male pattern baldness runs in like their genealogy. And so this was her example of, unless you have some context and know something about a particular cultural group, you'll probably misunderstand why they do things. So and she gave an example of Christians too, and I don't remember exactly. I don't remember what her example was, but it was also one of those things where it's like, oh, Christians do this every. Oh, it was the offering, and she said she talked like she had an intercultural group go to church, and they had the whole thing where they have the song and they bring the offering up, right? And in our church we sing praise God from whom all blessings flow, right? And then the priest like makes the sign of the cross over it, and everybody is like, yay, and they do this whole thing. And that person thought that Christians worshipped money because they made such a big deal of it, and because they blessed the money. And in like a Jewish synagogue, there's nothing like that in the Jewish synagogue. In a synagogue, you pay a temple tax, basically, essentially. Like they just tell you like you owe this much money, and it's like a club fee or something like that. Like they don't. So anyway, so she says if you don't understand the context, and just like me using that term club fee, right? That's not an accurate description of Jewish tithing. But anyway, if you don't understand something about the context and the social organization, you're not going to have any idea what's happening, and you'll make an incorrect interpretation. So in social scientific criticism, we need to have a knowledge of social and religious institutions in order to comprehend the world of the Bible. So we might ask, what does sacrifice mean to the Hebrew people? Or the reading of Torah in public, like King Josiah does in the Book of Kings? How did the prophets operate, and why did people believe them? Social scientific criticism as a method looks to, as when it comes to methodology and how do we do this, they generally look, since we don't have access to ancient Israel besides through the biblical text, and we've talked over the past couple weeks about how the biblical text represents hundreds of years of writers and editors and redactors having their say, right? So that doesn't tell us about any one specific time in ancient Israel. It tells us about a several 100-year period that's all kind of being brought together. And so, I mean, even if we looked at different practices in America over the past 20 years, there's a huge amount of change, even just in those 20 years in certain core things of our society. So it doesn't necessarily help just to have the Bible. The Bible, as we said in our earlier things, it needs to be anchored in something. So social scientific criticism is trying to anchor it in sociology and anthropology and archaeology, and some even will bring in psychology to try and describe things. So they'll look at cross-cultural studies of social groups in order to develop theories about what ancient Hebrew culture might have been like. So, for instance, they may look at the Nur people of South Sudan, as I did in a sermon maybe 2 months ago, and how their kinship and marriage systems work, and use that as a way to build a model of how ancient Israel might have operated. They may look at Bedouin tribes of Arabia to see how power and authority are used and passed down from one generation to another, and use that as a model to see how ancient Israel might have operated. They also look at archaeological data as much as is available, right? Because there's a lot available, but it really pales in comparison to what we actually would need to make a lot of descriptions. Because if you get into Jerusalem, very few people are doing archaeological digs in Jerusalem. There are some, but it's very politicized, and people live there. And that goes for all the rest of that area. There are places where you can't dig because people live there, or you can't dig because the politics aren't right. So archaeological data is great, but we don't always have as much as we need. So what they'll do with the archaeological data too, each site will have layers depending on the time period. So if there was a village there in the Bronze Age, maybe that village got destroyed in the late Bronze Age, and so there wasn't a village there in the Iron Age, but somebody came and resettled it in the Second Iron Age. So there are all these kind of layers, and we talk about people living there still, right? That's another layer that if those villages got destroyed, say like these kibbutzim that are being destroyed by Hamas, right? Or got destroyed by Hamas, right? If those got leveled, then that's a destruction layer, and whatever gets built on top of it is going to be a new layer of archaeological data. And whatever comes back to replace it won't be exactly what was built there. So, even if we look at churches, if at some point we were to have this church was not here, and this church was built in the 1930s, I think, or the 1940s, if we built a new church on this site, because of our needs, the layout would be different. And just kind of depending on what's happening in the culture of the time, what our needs are, the layout would be different. So those are the reasons why there are different layers. But looking at these layers give us clues about how the people lived, and then the biblical scholars will see if they can make that match up with the biblical account. So let's get to the key terms. So the first one is model or typology. So in sociology, a model or typology is a theoretical construct. It's not an actual thing, right? Like if you have a model of something in your mind, it's not an actual thing, right? If you said a model St. Andrew's churchgoer, well, on any given Sunday, we have 45 people here. So whatever that model is, whatever is typical of most of us that becomes the model is not an actual thing, right? But it can tell us something about the people that go here. But it won't necessarily get to the individual. So it's not so a model or a typology is a theoretical construct. And it's a construct usually of a society's social, cultural, or religious institutions or their structures. It might be a legal structure, and they look at these based on their cross-cultural study. So basically what a model does is it tries to take something that's very complex and simplify it. So we look at other cultures as ways to see what might have been the reality for the biblical people. We may look at ancient cultures and we may look at modern cultures. And we'll build a model and then we'll see if it fits with what the biblical narrative says. So I have up here Amphictyony. I did this just for fun, but actually Amphictyony, I have it up here because this is a model that was used to try and describe ancient Israel by, you remember our friend Martin Knopf? He's the guy who came up with within the documentary hypothesis. He's the one that said that Deuteronomy was completely separate, and that Deuteronomy all the way through 2 Kings made up a Deuteronomic history that was written by one group of people. Like they had one worldview and they wrote all those texts. So that was Martin Knopf, and he talked about ancient Israel as an Amphictyony. And Amphictyony it's a social structure. And it's a model based on what we know about ancient Greek society. And Amphictyony is the idea that there are several tribes that live in a fairly close area. And while they're completely separate units, they share religious sites like shrines, like oracles or temples. And So Noth said this describes the 12 tribes of Israel, right? He's saying that they're all separate tribes, but there are specific cultural and religious sites that hold them together as one people. Now, since Noth's time, in the latter half of the 20th century and first century, almost every scholar has said this is ridiculous. This is not a good comparison. But as we'll see later, one of the important things about having these kind of models is that you put it out there and you learn something about it, what might have happened, and then it's critiqued to see whether it actually works or not. And actually that's what makes this scientific in a way. You know, people in biblical studies and humanities, they don't actually really want to be scientific. They want to have like a theory and everybody just accept it like you're really smart, that makes sense. But with scientific theories, right? You have a theory, you have a hypothesis, and you test it. And then if that doesn't work, you come up with a better hypothesis. So actually so in the best sense of social scientific criticism, this is what would happen is somebody makes a hypothesis, they make something really smart, and then a bunch of other people come and they say, actually, this is how it doesn't work. And then you try and better hypothesis. You get closer to the ideal. So it does actually it can actually be a scientific process. The next terms are sociology, anthropology. I brought these up in the introduction, and just simply put, sociology is the study of societies through their social institutions and structures. And anthropology is the study of human behavior and culture. Material culture, this comes to us through archaeology. So material, like it's made out of matter, right? It's not like up in space. It's not theoretical. It's material. So material culture we find through archaeology. Let's see if Irene can get in this time. So through archaeology, we find physical evidence that is left behind by a specific culture. Although in a lot of places, especially where there's a lot of trade going back and forth, sometimes it can be hard to tell which is which culture if there are multiple cultures living in one place. But what the evidence means is the most difficult task, as we have discussed in previous sessions, right? What does it mean that there is a plain pot here, but a decorative pot there, right? What does it mean that there's evidence of destruction of a certain city at a certain time period? Well, how do we anchor material culture and biblical history together? How do we put them together? Because it could just be happenstance that these two things coincide, but it could be descriptive. They could coincide exactly. What if they aren't related at all? How do we find material evidence for a nomadic group? Did we talk about that in one of the previous classes when we were talking about Abraham? How do you find evidence for Abraham when he was a nomadic sheep herder that was moving all over everywhere? Every story we have about Abraham, he's going somewhere. But then on the other hand, we have things like in some of the destruction around Jerusalem that happened when the Assyrians invaded. They found ostraca, which are broken pots that somebody wrote on, basically a letter, and they were passing messages back and forth from the villages outside of Jerusalem into Jerusalem and then back. And so those have specific names. They make reference to specific battles that we know happened. There are specific destruction layers at the cities where those were found. And so then you have these kind of anchors where you can say, oh, we have this part of First Kings, and I think it also shows up in Jeremiah. They're the exact same thing, and they tell they're copies of each other from one book to the other, and they describe the Assyrian invasion of Judah and how Jerusalem didn't fall to the Assyrians. Well, now we also have these letters, these notes that were going back and forth between the villages that got destroyed outside Jerusalem and the leadership in Jerusalem. So those give us a pretty good anchor to know that when we're talking about this Assyrian invasion, that's pretty rooted. So that's how material culture can help us. But on other things, when you're looking at a pot that's just a broken pot, that's in a destruction layer of a thing, you could match it up to a biblical biblical thing, but it might not. It might not be. We talked about Nelson Glick a couple weeks ago, calling the entrance gate at Tel Don Abraham's gate.
Yeah.
Which leads to our next term, which is anachronism. And anachronism is the tendency to look back at the past and project our current understanding backward in time. So projecting onto the older history things that we understand. For instance, I one time had a student who told me on an exam that Moses' main problem was his Islamic theology. Now, this would not be possible since Moses ostensibly lived 1,500 years before the Prophet Muhammad. What anachronism does is it telescopes, harmonizes, and projects the current onto the past. So if I look back 100 years to when my grandma was born and try and understand what was happening then, and I look back 500 years to the Protestant Reformation when King Henry VIII made the Episcopal Church or the Anglican Church a thing, separate from the Catholic Church. If I look back 1,500 years to Jerome, if I look 2,000 years back to Jesus, to me, it's flat. I didn't live it, and so you could tell me a bunch of things about it, and to me, it's just kind of flat history. Right? And as much as possible, I can try and make it 3D, but it's really 2D. We don't see the layers necessarily until we try and get into the depth. But this happens not just to us, it happens in the Bible too. So does everybody want to see an example? Let me change the slide real fast. So the Bible is also anachronistic, which helps us to see how it was written over time also, right? Or how the audience that is receiving it is different than the people that they're trying to talk about and the history that they're trying to talk about. So this is one. Both of them are from Exodus 21 and 22. And these are the legal codes. This is Moses has given the 10 Commandments, right? But now this is a priestly source, because now we're getting into legal codes, similar to what we find in Leviticus, but these are the covenant codes of Exodus. So it takes a break from the narrative to just go through a bunch of just legal, like mumbo jumbo, as it were. So it says, if a bull gores a man or woman to death, the bull is to be stoned to death, and its meat must not be eaten, but the owner of the bull will not be held responsible. If, however, the bull has had the habit of goring the owner, and the owner has been warned but has not kept it penned up, and it kills a man or woman, the bull is to be stoned, and its owner also is to be put to death. However, if payment is demanded, the owner may redeem his life by the payment of whatever is demanded. This law also applies if the bull gores a son or daughter. If the bull gores a male or female slave, the owner must pay 30 shekels or silver to the master of the slave, and the bull is to be stoned to death. So, why do I say that this one I'm going to say might be anachronistic. But the thing to remember about the biblical setting, right? They are nomads. They're running away from Egypt, and they're going to spend the next 40 years in the wilderness. Okay? Why is the bull being penned? How would we explain that? Why would we assume that there's an expectation that you would pen your animals in with a group that's constantly moving? Now, I'll say this. Somebody could say, especially if they're trying to harmonize the text, right? They could say, well, if you're a shepherd and you're a nomadic shepherd, then you're going to do something to make sure that your animals don't run away, right?
Yeah.
And if you have bulls, you don't want to fall victim to this penalty, you might find some sort of temporary situation. Okay. So maybe this isn't anachronistic. But let's look at Exodus 22. It says, if anyone grazes their livestock in a field or vineyard and lets them stray, and they graze in someone else's field, the offender must make restitution from the best of their own for their own field or vineyard. So if the last example was possibly anachronistic, I think this one is undoubtedly anachronistic. Why would a nomadic community have delineated fields and vineyards? Meaning that someone planted in a particular settled place and had to stay there to care for the crops as they grew and harvest them. What nomads do is they take their stuff with them and they hit certain places at certain times of the year, depending on what they're looking for. So if they're going to an oasis that has date palms, they're going to go to that oasis to get the dates when the dates are ripe. And maybe they planted them, but they're not staying there, and that doesn't belong to anybody. Right? When we start talking about personal property and we start talking about delineated borders of things, especially like vineyards where you have to plant grapes in order to consider it a vineyard, and it's got some sort of structure that would consider it a vineyard rather than just wild grapes that somebody's cared for, you have a sedentary society, not a nomadic society.
That's what I was just thinking. Yeah, there's
Vineyards, right. In vineyards, you have to tend to.
Right. So this is why I say this is anachronistic, right? Because ostensibly Moses is giving laws for people who are on the move. Now, if we wanted to harmonize the text, as a lot of people will love to do, what they'll say is Moses is so farsighted that he's making laws for when the people are sedentary. Okay, and maybe even some of the biblical, if there was a savvy biblical editor, this is a point at which they might say at the beginning of the entire narrative, just so that we know what's going on. And I didn't check to look if they did, but they could insert one sentence that said Moses is saying this for when you get into the promised land.
Right. Well, that's what I was going to say. If you look back at
so
the other one, it doesn't say if and when.
Right. Okay. So now I was a little bit lazy, and also I had a sick child at home today. Well, he was sick yesterday and he had to stay home from school because of the 24-hour wait period, and he's an extrovert. So but if I had gotten a little bit more time, I could have looked at the beginning of the covenant code and pulled out, well, did one of the editors or did somebody say when Moses starts this speech, this is for you when you get into the promised land? Because that takes care of retroactively any kind of anachronism that would be in the text. Okay. So let me see, what's my next slide? Okay. So let's look at the last couple of weeks. I've also wanted to explore some of the critiques of each of these methods, and this week is no different because each of these methods has been critiqued, and it's important because in order to make the method more usable, you have to get over the hurdles. So the person who talks, I think, most compellingly about this, his name is Gary Herian. And he says that social scientific criticism suffers from problems of anachronism. He says that too often commentators and interpreters are looking at culture through a modernist lens. And so they represent ancient peoples as if they were modern people with modern understandings of the world. So he says especially what we see when we look back at when we start doing social scientific criticism is that modern scholars will assume cynicism and secularism back on the ancient people, and this is how it happens. So he would say something like a modern scholar might say it couldn't possibly be that somebody believed in all of this stuff, right? There must have been some economic gain or attainable power that they were after. So you'll see this in social scientific. So we're building these models, these typologies, right? And they're built on understandings of social or cultural institutions or structures. So if we're talking about an economic structure, when you're talking about sacrificing, or we talked about this Sunday, right, with the turning over of the exchange tables and with the taxation, right? Whose image is on the coin? Okay, so people will read back. That's an economic system, right? The temple tax is an economic system for that holds the institution. Now, a social scientific critic, if they're not careful, will then say this was just an economic system to get as much money into the institution of the temple as possible, and they will deny the possibility that the priests and the high priests actually believed what they were talking, that they believed that the temple held the presence of God, right? So they'll take a cynical view, a secular view, and say this was just a money grab. These people didn't actually, and people say that about the church today, don't they?
Yeah.
Right? They say it's a money grab. These mega church pastors, they don't believe what they're saying, right? Or these people who do these rituals in these denominational churches, they don't believe in like that the Holy Spirit is coming down and somehow inhabiting the bread and the wine and making Christ present. They don't believe that. This is just a fancy way of getting people to support buildings and institutions. So that's one of the issues that he says. When a social scientific critic will prize their model, like the economic model or the power attainment model or something like that, and they will project that back onto the text and say, well, the people didn't actually have a religious belief behind this. It was just the system. It was just this economic system that's going on. So he says political systems. Yeah. So one of the ones I was reading was about who was it? It was the book of Judges, Judges chapter 9. One of the sons of Gideon. Gideon had like 70 sons. And one of them, his name, and Gideon's name, interestingly, Gideon's in Judges 8, but in Judges 9, they call him Jerubbaal. People assume they're the same person, but again, it's a name change. So it could be a completely different strand of tradition. Anyway, it's associated with Gideon and his son Abimelech, right? And we've seen lots of Abimelechs, right? Son of the king. We saw it in Genesis, right? So and multiple Abimelechs. So Abimelech, his son, by his second wife, who's not on a same socioeconomic scale as his first wife, or his first series of wives, because he had 70 legitimate children through his higher social status wives. And Abimelech is from a secondary wife, not a second wife, a secondary wife. And Abimelech goes to the people of Shechem. It's a city in Samaria, where they are, and they're his mother's kin, and he gets them to join him so that he can take Gideon's throne. Although Gideon didn't sit on the throne, but so he can take Gideon's power. And so he kills all of his half brothers except for one of them escapes. And so there are all these kind of explanations, and then eventually he loses favor, and then he's killed by who's he killed by? He's killed by a woman who rolls a millstone. He's invading a village that he's trying to take reprisals on because they didn't support his claim, and a woman throws a millstone down and it crushes him. So the social scientific theorists are saying, well, why did the people follow him? It must have to do with kinship and marriage. And why did these people support him even when all these oracles and stuff were being spoken against him? They must have had an economic interest. And so they're trying to explain what are the systems that would account for the fact that this story doesn't seem to make sense in some ways, and that we don't get enough information. We don't get modern information we want as modern readers to understand the psychology and the economics and all the other stuff that's going on, because the biblical author doesn't care about that. The biblical author cares about the fact that here's this person who tried to seize power, but God didn't give them a divine right to that power, and so he eventually dies an ignominious death. So anyway, that's one of the examples of where you could go you could go haywire on the social scientific stuff, and it might be
Right.
interesting,
Mhm.
but it might not tell you why the writer of the book wanted to do that. So anyway, so Gary Herian says that modernism has 4 assumptions that social scientific critics of the Bible need to be aware of. The first one is our inheritance of positivism from modern post Enlightenment modernism. And positivism is this idea that we can attain knowledge through reason and scientific methods. Right? So we talked about hypothesis, test, conclusion, hypothesis, test, conclusion, right? And if you do that enough times, you're gonna find the truth. Okay. Number 2 is reductionism. And this is why I brought up models and typologies, because models and typologies are a type of reduction. So it's reducing things to typical groups, or so sometimes we talk about typicality conditions. So like, how do you know that a Chihuahua and a Husky are both dogs, but a wolf is not a dog? And then you would talk about, you'd have to make a model, some sort of model of dog that fits Chihuahua and Husky, but not wolf. Right? So that requires a certain amount of reduction, right? We're not talking about individuals here. We're talking about this kind of hypothetical model. The third thing is relativism. And relativism is the idea that morals, ethics, and religion are not universally true, but only true for a certain group. So we might say it's relative. Like if it's relative to that group. Like we might look at another culture and they have let's say something that we find abhorrent is honor killings, right? In Middle Eastern culture, right? If a daughter is raped or actually goes out and has a relationship, that then her parent has the right to kill her, right? And actually we find some of that in what we read in sometimes what we read in the Bible too. If you get to Deuteronomy 22, which we'll talk about a little bit later, it's this huge thing that has to do with virgin daughters and what are the rules surrounding them. So so we have this idea that that there's relativism, right? We can accept that was part of the culture, even though we find it abhorrent in our culture. The fourth one is determinism. And I think this is actually, for me, probably the most important one, and the one that can get people off base rather quickly, is because determinism is the idea that certain social constructs determine human actions and values. That the values of individuals within that culture are socially determined. That we actually don't really make that many choices. So this is the idea of cause and effect, right? That there's a cause and there's an effect. And if we know what the cause is, we can determine what the effect probably will be. If we use our reason, right? That's again back to positivism. When positivism gets in, then we say, here's the cause, here's the effect. And we assume that there's one cause, one effect, right? That there couldn't be multiple effects because reason tells us that this is the most likely thing. So this is the critique of Gary Herian. So let me get to the point. Oh, here we go. So, oh yeah, I forgot that I put this in here, but here's Herian's solutions. He puts actually some solutions out for how to avoid this kind of modernist anachronism. So he says, number 1, don't be so certain. That's the positivist, right? Don't be so certain that of your interpretation that you become anachronistic and ignore biblical details that contradict your narrative. So one of the things he brings up, there's a scholar named Wilson, who talks about prophetic culture and prophecy as an institution in ancient Israel, and all of the different structures that would have to exist in order to support the prophet. And then he puts all of the prophets into this box. Okay, so he says there had to be the prophet, there had to be people who wrote it down, but there were also schools that supported him, and there were and of course there are like apostles and all that kind of stuff, just like Jesus had, right? People who are spreading his message. But then the other thing he says is that prophecy was a culture. There was a prophetic culture. So there are court prophets, there are temple prophets, there are royal prophets, there are prophets out in the boonies. There are all these kind of prophets operating, but they all are bringing in all this same cultural material, and they're just the mouthpiece for the culture. So it's not that the individual prophet has something really interesting or dramatic to say, so much as the culture is speaking through them things that the culture needs to hear. And so this actually takes away a lot of the power of the prophet, right? But then he sets up this whole structure of how prophecy works. And then Harrion says to Wilson, what about Jeremiah 15:17? I sat alone because your hand was upon me, for you filled me with indignation. What about a prophet like Jeremiah, who seems to be solitary and doesn't fit into your box? He says, you were too certain, and you made this nice little box, and you carried it all the way through to the end in this, if I can use my reason to go all the way through to the end and make all the pieces fit. But you have extra pieces that you left in the box, right? So he says scholars a lot of times, because they want to get published, get stuck in this kind of, I made this and now I have to make it work so I can get published. So he says, don't be so certain. The second thing is, he says, a model is a great way to start, but the discrepancies are actually really good opportunities to explore how ancient Israel might have been different or unique. So a lot of times scholars, when they see something like this Jeremiah thing that doesn't fit their model, they just wash over it, and they just take it out. They don't talk about it. He says, actually, that's the really interesting point for social scientific criticism, is where you can say, this is how ancient Israel doesn't fit the model in this text. Number 3 is, be careful about someone claiming to be dispassionate or objective, which is one of the things that coming out of modernism, out of the Enlightenment, right? If you're using pure reason, and you should be able to have this, we should be able to find the truth by being dispassionate and objective, right? We're not subjective, we're not passionate, we're not ideological. We're just trying to give the truth, right? He says, be careful about anyone claiming to be dispassionate or objective, because it's a hiding place for ideological readings of the Bible that supports specious and unscientific claims. So it's somebody pretending to be scientific, but it only backs up their own ideological reading that they're already bringing to the text. And that is called scientism, not science. Scientism is when you use scientific methodology, but you're not actually doing anything scientific. So the fourth thing is, he says, social scientific interpretation should always be open to critique and modification as more information becomes available. And so I put amphictyony here, right? Because we talked about how you have a hypothesis and everybody said, it works? No, wait, it doesn't work. Okay, let's go back to the drawing board. So he says, in order for social scientific criticism to work, it always has to be open to critique and to change. Just like science is, right? Okay, so the point is, most scholars agree that understanding the social dimensions of a culture and religion of ancient Israel helps us to understand new dimensions of the Bible. But we have to be careful, just like we discussed in the first class, because there's a limit to what we can know empirically, right? As truth, capital T, or what we can know for certain, even about our own culture, not to mention an ancient one. So let's get into our application. An American material cultural artifact. the McDonald's coffee cup. So, what might a social scientific critic learn about us from this cup? So, say 1,000 years from now, a scientist went up onto one of our piles of garbage and found just tons and tons of coffee cups. What do you think that they would learn about us? From if they were trying to build a model of who the Americans were, and one of their things that they had as a representation of who we are was a coffee cup. What might they say about our economics, about our politics, about our religions? Say instead of finding it on a garbage pile, they found, say that this building got knocked over and all of our trash was still in it, and they found a bunch of coffee cups. You know, a lot of churches have coffee hour, right?
Mm-hmm.
What if they just found a whole stash of coffee cups in this church, and they knew this is a temple of the 21st century Christians. By the way, all if they're not careful, they might say of all Christians, right? Because they're trying to make a model. How big is your model? Are we talking the Episcopal Church? Or are we talking about like evangelical Christians and denominational Christians? Are we talking just denominational Christians? You know, what are we talking? So how are we delineating that group? But we found these coffee cups in this religious institution. What might they say about us?
It's an important item.
Okay, so they
worship
might
coffee.
Right.
They might-
The coffee is part of our worship.
they might say that coffee is part of our worship, right?
Obviously, we had rules.
Okay,
Because
right.
caution, content.
What did Marlena say?
She said so this is actually from the legal structure, right? Which is one of the reasons I brought this image is so great, is because from a legal structural standpoint, right? It says hot, caution, contents hot. Do you remember all the lawsuit that got this
Right,
all
right.
put on these labels on all these coffee cups from McDonald's and everywhere else? Right?
So we had to have laws and rules and.
So they could
governance-
say something about
governance.
warning labels in general, right? They could do somebody could do a whole book about warning labels in American culture, and I'm sure probably somebody has, right? And what does that tell us about Americans? Well, they were stupid and they needed warning labels, right?
We were
Or
afraid of coffee. We were afraid of coffee.
we were afraid of coffee, or we only drank coffee hot,
That's an idea.
right? They
also
only
might think, what a waste of their money for non-caloric intake.
what a waste. Hey, listen, if we're talking about religious institutions, they got these people addicted to this highly addictive substance so that they'd keep coming back. Right? If they were looking at us and they didn't take and they looked at us as a secular culture, they're like, oh, America was a secular culture and a cynical culture. Everybody in America they knew better. They were postmodern people, and they knew better. All the church had left was to get them hopped up on some sort of drug that would get them coming back over and over again. Right? And would we say that's an accurate description of? I had a professor that said, kind of tongue in cheek, this was before the pandemic when Crossroads was still doing their, free coffee, come in and get it kind of thing. He said, the most successful coffee shop in Cincinnati is Crossroads Church. But you can see how we might get this wrong if we just took it at face value. If one theorist came in and said, this explains everything. Right? And we weren't actually we were being scientific about it, but not scientific about it. Right? If we don't allow other people to come in and say, well, that's ridiculous, I have other evidence. Right? So that was kind of a fun, just kind of tongue in cheek one. But how about this? From our culture, I don't know how many of you have read Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, but let me just set up this quote. So this is a world where people are not allowed to have monogamous relationships. They have rejected the ideas of truth and beauty and replaced them with happiness and stability. Babies are created in a laboratory and then separated into castes where they're conditioned genetically and physically to be content with their status in life. So they also take a drug called soma to stabilize their emotions so that nobody gets too high and nobody gets too low. There is no religion and there's no belief in God, as those often lead to instability. Okay, so that's a Brave New World. Now this quote is from one of the characters in the book named Mustafa Mond, and Mustafa Mond is one of the world controllers. So they're the people at the top that make sure that everything, that the whole system works. Now Mustafa Mond was a former scientist, and this is his understanding of our system of love and marriage. Okay, mother, monogamy, romance. Notice these are models and typologies, right? Mm-hmm. Mother, monogamy, romance. High spurts the fountain, fierce the foamy and wild jet, or fierce and foamy the wild jet. That's a danger, right? So he's talking about emotional instability. The urge has but a single outlet. My love, my baby. No wonder those poor pre-moderns were mad and wicked and miserable. Their world didn't allow them to take things easily, didn't allow them to be sane, virtuous, happy. What with mothers and lovers, what with the prohibitions they were not conditioned to obey, what with the temptations and the lonely remorses, what with all the diseases and the endless isolating pain, what with the uncertainties and the poverty they were forced to feel strongly. So that is some, a fictional character several hundred years after our time, looking back at us in a social scientific way and saying these are the problems with their society from my perspective, right? Because from their perspective, stability is the most important thing. So he makes these models of mother and monogamy and romance and problematizes them. So, and then did I skip the last part of the quote? Oh yeah, I was on another place. Okay, and feeling strongly, what was more, in solitude, in hopelessly individual isolation, how could they be stable? So again, there we see stability is the important thing, right? So, what institutions are involved in this? This idea of marriage, of motherhood and monogamy. There are cultural institutions, religious institutions, legal and familial institutions. And how would they understand them? Well, Mustafa Mond understands them in what way?
Negatively.
Definitely negatively. The familial institution, right, is a place in which you actually become more isolated, according to Mustafa Mond, right? It is, right? It causes strong feelings. Well, we all know if you've been married or been in a relationship or had children, you know that difference of opinions happen, and actually that can make you feel more isolated, right? If somebody doesn't understand you or you feel invisible, it does feel isolating rather than connected. It can. So what kinds of things might they look like, or might they look for in our material culture, like in our church buildings? And they might look at church buildings or marriage certificates or legal records or church records or divorce records, wedding websites. How would they interpret them if they had to make a model or typology based on them? For instance, to take one example, what would they say? And this will actually kind of lead pretty well into our biblical example. what would they say about people getting married inside of a church or getting married like on a vacation wedding out or like in the woods or like a venue or something like that? If somebody looked at all the evidence of our culture and what we, you know, our stories that we tell about marriage, what would they say? They might say, oh, people at one point got married in churches because religion was important to them. And slowly, as the society got more secular, everybody got married in the woods. Everybody got married on the beach. Everybody got married outside of the church. When we know actually in our culture, these things happen, these overlap. Individual people make individual decisions. What they do is not necessarily determined by the culture, although it's influenced by the culture, right? People see pictures of a great wedding venue and they say, oh, I want to have my wedding there. Or what happens when you are like cathedrals and stuff like that actually is a really funny example. So if you go to the cathedral, St. Andrew's Cathedral in Honolulu on any given day, especially in the summer, you'll see kind of like bus after bus of Japanese tourists coming in, and they'll get off and there'll be a whole wedding party, and there'll be a bride in a white dress and a groom in a tuxedo and all of their people dressed up and bridesmaids and all this kind of the kind of cultural trappings of an American wedding. And they'll go and they'll take pictures inside the cathedral and on the steps of the cathedral and do all the wedding pictures, but they don't actually do the wedding because they already had their wedding in Japan. And they did the Japanese traditional wedding in Japan. And then they come over because the cultural influence of America is so strong. They come over and they do that thing. How greatly would that be misinterpreted? Or could it be misinterpreted if we had a deterministic view and a relativistic view of what was happening? So what kind of conclusions might they come to, these people in Brave New World? What might they come to about our cultural understanding of marriage? Would they be able to understand why individual people got married in or out of the church? Maybe. Would they understand why people got divorced or not? What if they looked at divorce as simply an economic thing, as having to do with economics rather than personal emotions? Right? They might have a great sociological or psychological explanation for it, but that might not necessarily explain what if you came into Cincinnati, Ohio on October 24th, 2023, you might not be able to describe what's happening. Okay, so just for fun, I want to share the outsider's perspective from the book, because Aldous Huxley, what's really interesting about this book is he brings somebody from outside of this society to show that in dystopias, you have to have somebody outside the society show you what's wrong with the society, right? Otherwise it seems perfect. So John, in the book, also known as, he's called the Savage. He's from America. So Brave New World happens in England. That society is an English society. And in America, there's no social stability and people are living the old ways. John has a mother who's addicted to alcohol, for instance. Okay? By a rather elaborate displacement motif, which I'm not going to go into, but displacement motifs are like when Joseph's brothers throw him in the pit, right? That's how he gets to Egypt. So John has this displacement motif that gets him from America, and he ends up going to the stable England with one of the characters, with one of the main characters, Lenina. So after seeing how their society works and becoming something of a celebrity because he's the savage from the outside, John actually rejects their world. And here's his quote, and this is really just for fun, but because a lot of people look at Brave New World as this kind of like anti-religious kind of thing. But if you actually read the book, Aldous Huxley is a lot more sophisticated than that. He says, so this is John speaking. He says, but I don't want comfort. And he's talking to Mustafa Mond. I don't want comfort. I want God. I want poetry. I want real danger. I want freedom. I want goodness. I want sin. In fact, said Mustafa Mond, you're claiming the right to be unhappy. All right then, said the savage defiantly, I'm claiming the right to be unhappy. not to mention the right to grow old and ugly and impotent, the right to have syphilis and cancer, the right to have too little to eat, the right to be lousy, the right to live in constant apprehension of what may happen tomorrow, the right to catch typhoid, the right to be tortured by unspeakable pains of every kind. There was a long silence. I claim them all, the savage said at last. And this is a juxtaposition, right? Especially by saying, not calling him John, by using his title, Savage. What Aldous Huxley is doing is giving us a juxtaposition and asking which one is more savage. A society who completely takes away freedom and takes away emotion and takes away connection, that romantic connection and things like that, right? Or somebody who's actually living a human life. So that I found that. So when people tell me that Brave New World is this kind of like atheistic kind of document, I'm like, maybe
Did
read
you
it more.
really read
Maybe
it?
read it more closely.
Yeah.
All right.
It's a Twilight Zone.
So let's get to our biblical passage. I think we're just about the hour mark from when we actually got started. So this, and I didn't write it here, but it's in my bibliography. This comes from a text called Marriage Gifts by Tracy, why am I blanking on her name? Lemos, Tracy Lemos. And so she's talking in her, it was her doctoral dissertation from 2010. And she talks about looking at ancient Israel through the lens of their marriage rituals through bride wealth and dowry. So she gives some examples in her book of bride wealth, and she says Genesis 34, which is Dinah and Shechem, which is the quote that I had at the beginning, right, where Dinah's brothers say, Shechem says, "I'll pay any price you want. I just really love your sister." And the sons of Jacob, who are the tribes of Israel, who become the tribes of Israel, right? They say, "You need to have all of your people circumcised. That's the price." And then, of course, as they're healing and feverish from being circumcised, the brothers come in and slaughter them all. So that's a very heavy bride price. But so she says this is an example of bride wealth. So bride wealth is when the groom or the person who's marrying gives something of substance to the other family. It doesn't go into any kind of pot for this family that's coming to be. It's really like, I'm paying you for your daughter. Okay? So the wealth goes into the family. The daughter's family. Exodus 22 and Deuteronomy 22, which I say here is Deuteronomy 22 an expansion of Exodus 22. I didn't put Deuteronomy 22 because it's so long. But the example from Exodus 22 are just these two verses. This is, when a man seduces a virgin who is not engaged to be married and lies with her, he shall give the bride price for her and make her his wife. But if her father refuses to give her to him, he shall pay an amount equal to the bride price for virgins. Right? So this tells us that bride wealth, this idea that the person who wants to marry the daughter would give money or property or something to the family in exchange. It's an exchange system. And Deuteronomy 22 takes that, but then expands it. It's like, well, what if he raped her? What if he raped her in the city? And what if he raped her out in the cornfield where nobody could hear her scream? Because they also had rules about rape, like when is it rape and when is it not? When is the woman culpable for rape and when she's not culpable for rape, right? That's all laid out in Deuteronomy 22, which is an expansion of this Exodus 22 idea. Another bride wealth example is Genesis 24, and that's Isaac and Rebekah. So this is when the camels had finished drinking, the man, because remember, Isaac never spoke to his father again after the sacrifice. of the attempted sacrifice. But Abraham sent somebody to Bethuel, was Rebekah's father, because he's kin to them, and says, I need you to get a bride for my son Isaac. Okay, so he's met Rebekah at the well, and so she's watered she's given water to his camels. And when the camels had finished drinking, the man took a gold nose ring weighing half a shekel and 2 bracelets for her arms weighing 10 gold shekels, and said, tell me whose daughter you are. Is there room in your father's house for us to spend the night? So what Lemos says is this is a bride price. He's giving these things to the family as compensation for taking the daughter. Okay, that's an exchange. Now, a gold nose ring, I'm like, wouldn't she put that on her nose? But so actually what Lemos says is, she sees this as bride wealth, but it's also possible that this could be dowry. This is not a 100% kind of thing. But then let's look at dowry. Dowry is when the daughter's family, or it could be the son's family too, but gives money that then is put that the couple has, right? So either the couple has or the groom's family, right, has. And so a lot of times, in some ancient Israeli, there's the idea of ketuvah, which is you write. It's basically a what is it? The prenuptial agreement. And you would actually set the dowry would be stipulated in that ketuvah. So if there was ever a divorce, that the bride would have that as kind of a bank account. So dowry works in a couple of different ways, but here's what she says. But dowry is something that then it doesn't go to the bride's family. And so she sees Genesis 29, verses 24 and 29. And this is Jacob, Leah, Rachel, Zilpah, and Bilhah. So Laban gave his maid Zilpah to his daughter Leah to be her maid. And this is after Jacob has married Leah, right? He's given 7 years of his time, and that's, I think, sort of a bride wealth kind of thing. It's an economic exchange, right? He's given 7 years of labor, and he's supposed to marry Rachel, but Laban sneaks Leah in there under the cover of darkness, and when he wakes up in the morning, he finds out that he slept with the wrong sister. So now he's married to her. But as part of his bride, the dowry, she gets the maid, right? And then later on, when he finally, after another 7 years, gets to marry Rachel, Laban gives his maid Bilhah to his daughter Rachel to be her maid. So Lemos sees this as a kind of dowry. In Joshua 15, 16, 19, this is Caleb, and it says, and Caleb said, whoever attacks Kiriath Sefer and takes it, to him I will give my daughter Achsah as wife. Othniel, son of Kenaz, the brother of Caleb, took it, and he gave him his daughter Achsah as wife. When she came to him, she urged him to ask her father for a field. As she dismounted from her donkey, Caleb said to her, what do you wish? And she said to him, give me a present. Since you have set me in the land of the Negev, give me springs of water as well. So Caleb gave her the upper springs and the lower springs. So she considers this a dowry because after being married, she's received this. It's not going to the father's family, the father's family, right? The father of the bride's family. And then this last one she uses an example, 1 Kings 9, verse 16. Pharaoh, king of Egypt, had gone up and captured Gezer and burned it down and killed the Canaanites who lived in the city and had given it as a dowry to his daughter, Solomon's wife. So what Lemos is having us notice here, is that there are two different systems of marriage gift that are biblical, right? Quote unquote biblical. We see both of these different types. So then she moves on to, so how do we explain this, right? So she moves on to anthropological models and typologies. And she starts with Jack Goody, who's an anthropologist. and sociologists studying African tribes, the Nur tribe, the Talensi tribe, the Levedu tribe, as well as one North Indian tribe. And Goody says that bride wealth versus dowry comes down to societal structure and hierarchy. So you see how he's talking about these kind of bigger top level structures and hierarchies. So he says non-hierarchical societies use bride wealth because it creates a societal fund or circulating pool of resources. It keeps wealth within the community when the daughter leaves. Hierarchical societies, they give dowry because socially stratified societies want to keep familial property and wealth. So in other words, what they're saying is, if your daughter has an economic value, i.e., she can help with the farming, or in some way she can create pottery, she can do something that adds to the ability of the family to make money, then the family has to be compensated for that in a non-hierarchical society. But if you get into a hierarchical society where people are living more urbanized lives, probably, right? They're not necessarily farming every day, but they're living in urban centers and they're doing stuff like that. You don't then you're not compensating the family for this economic loss. And actually, if your family has a higher social status, the family with the lower social status might be the one that's paying the dowry in order to marry into the higher social status family. So that's why she says, or that's what Jack Goody says, and Tracy Lemos takes that, and she applies it to ancient Babylonia. So this is applicable to ancient Israel because we know that Israel was in Babylon in captivity. So certain things that might have happened in Babylonia, they would have at least been culturally aware of. And so she studied Babylonia, and she said that as social stratification increased, dowry became more prevalent as people tried to retain their wealth. So Babylonian marriage contracts, this gets into the we're starting to get into the archaeological. They have marriage contracts from the 6th century in Babylon, and they have troves of these. And the contracts show that people who have wealth make dowry contracts more often than poorer people who tend to use bride wealth. Now, my question to this is, but if they can afford a scribe to write a contract, doesn't that say something about their wealth? Because Joe Schmo out in the sticks is not coming into the city and hiring a scribe with what precious little money he has, right, in order to settle this kind of legal contract. What happens if the social location within Babylon is within Babylonia or is within rural areas? That might change whether you have a contract or not. And also, it's not 100% that people that have higher social status are using dowry rather than bride wealth. That also could come down to different reasons than social stratification. It come down to culture, whether somebody's traditional or progressive. Right? There are all kinds of other reasons why that could be the case. But her next thing so that's just one of her things. The next thing, she looks at the material culture of Israel, and she says, if you look at Iron Age 1 and Iron Age 2 and trace the change in hierarchy of those societies, then you'll also see the change between bride wealth and dowry. So what she says is, and this is based on the model that Jack Goody set up in his studies. So Iron Age 1 is 1200 BC to 1000 BC. And what she says, if you look at the material evidence like towns and villages, it's non-hierarchical. There's little social stratification. So how she tells this, the reason she says this is the case is because there's no evidence of luxury goods, which she thinks would be, in most archaeologists would say, is an indicator of social stratification. Also, the houses tend to all be the same size, and the villages are very small and are surrounded and form the basis of a sedentary farming lifestyle. Okay, so that's the context of Iron Age 1 in the material culture. Iron Age 2 from 1000 BC to 539 BC. Now, a lot of things happened, but 539 BC is the fall of the Babylonian Empire, which is why they put the end date of Iron Age 2 there. She says it was hierarchical and there was greater social stratification, and also they used dowries more, is her. So what she's saying is there are bigger cities, there's a greater diversity in sizes of houses, which she says if you have a different sizes of houses, you should have social stratification. That's her assumption. And there's evidence of luxury goods. So you might have a decorated pot rather than a plain pot, or you might have silver in one area, whereas you might only have ceramics in another area. So my question is, so what she says is Iron Age 1 was bride wealth and Iron Age 2 is dowry. And she said that's why all these biblical passages exist. And when she looks back at the biblical passages, she says, if we look at the sources, we talked about source criticism, and we use the dating of the sources, we can see that the passages that use bride wealth are dated by source critics to earlier in Iron Age 1. And the ones that use dowry, according to the source critics, come from Iron Age 2. Now, you have to believe the source critics in order. This is one of it can be kind of circular. It's kind of one of those give me the first miracle and I can explain the rest. Because you have to believe the source critics that these are the date, that these are when these are supposed to be dated, right? The J source, the E source, the P source, the D source. So my question is it possible that both could have been operating at the same time, bride wealth and dowry? And how do we know it was wealth that determined the type of marriage exchange, right? We talked about determinism. How do we know it was wealth that determined the social stratification that was the determining factor in whether somebody used bride wealth or dowry? Can we see the usefulness of reductionism? Like if you make a model and you say, this seems to fit. Yeah, I mean, it gives us a better clue than we had before. But it also has its downsides, because if you just have a strict cause and effect and you strictly deterministic, strictly relativistic, then and strictly positivistic, right? We can know the truth. Then you're going to take all these puzzle pieces and put them together, and everything that doesn't fit your model just sits outside. So in the end, social scientific criticism, I think, is very interesting. We can talk about things like I did on Sunday with the coins in the temple. We can talk about marriage gifts and notice that there are different patterns of marriage gift giving. And it can give us a way to look at social, cultural, and religious aspects of the Bible through the lens of other societies. But it can't give us certainty about how any individual stage of biblical society would have perceived all of the possibilities available to them. So we have to remain aware of the four modernist assumptions that cause anachronistic interpretations if we're going to use it properly. We have to be willing, as Harrian said, we have to be willing to actually be scientific and say hypothesis, test, conclusion, new hypothesis. Which means that we should be very careful saying things, and when you hear people saying things like, marriage in the Bible was. Because more than likely, if you're trying to make one monolithic model for marriage in the Bible, number one, you're going to be wrong, because there are multiple versions. I mean, even just polygamy, right, versus monogamy. We see both modeled in the Bible. So anytime you get into those big models, you have to realize that as much as they tell you, there's as much or more that they don't tell you. And here is my bibliography. I didn't talk about Ehud Ben Zvi a lot, but I didn't talk about him at all. But he's also a social science. His stuff fits in social scientific, because he's trying to say how the Bible was written by Yehudite, post-exilic Yehudite literati. That means 99% of the population was illiterate. There was 1% of the population that was literate, and they were responsible for writing the Bible after the Persians took over Babylon. So that's his stance. But then these other three we did use. All right. So let me just do a quick outro so that when I put this on YouTube, it's nice and kind of bookended by welcome and outro, and then we can have a little bit of discussion if anybody wants. Okay, so that is the social scientific criticism of the Bible. I thank you for joining us online and in person, and we will see you next week. And next week we're going to be talking about narrative and literary criticism of the Bible. No, not next week. Next week for anybody who's watching on YouTube, or next minute for anybody who's watching on YouTube. But next week is October 31st, so we'll be back the first week of November, and we'll be talking about narrative and literary criticism of the Bible.
Sign me up for the Christian